the fact that the founder needs to move from the doer to the architect, that design phase, to the steward, which is the sustainability phase, all along the way generating value and free cash flow, which, as you say, that is the foundation of growth. And I always like to say, turnover is vanity, profit is sanity, and cash flow is reality. And you cannot build cash flow without profit, because turnover does not create sustainable cash flow. So I'd like to look at the Courier Guy case study, which you mentioned, and it was fascinating. This guy starts this business on 2,000 rands worth of capital back in the year 2000, and he's got his motorbike, and he becomes known as the Courier Guy. And eventually, in 2024, that business is sold for a substantial sum of money. But what is interesting about this to me is not just the fact that it was this small business that grew, that sold. It was the strategic thinking and planning that was necessary along the way to transition all the way and do what so few small businesses are able to do. And your experience in startups and the venture capital, but particularly the funding of startups more than the VC work, that failure rate is significant, largely due to the founder's inability to make those transitions. So would you like to run through the Courier Guy case study in that framework of doer, architect, steward?
Yeah, no, it's a very interesting, case study. So I came across it again as I did the research. So the founder, so the doer, architect, steward, these are concepts I came up with as I reflected on, what am I grappling with? What are the transitions that the founder needs to make? So one of the points I make in chapter 2 is that the founder is the constraint to creating this business that becomes valuable, where you can create genuine wealth and have an institution. So I'm making the point that one of the constraints then is also around the founder centrality. In other words, in the smaller businesses and even larger businesses, I've seen larger businesses where the founder is still central. So all the decisions, everything goes through the founder, all the approvals needs to go to the founder and so on. And I think that's what the entrepreneur behind the Courier Guy did differently. So he started off essentially almost by accident. I think he was unemployed, living in someone's back room, and then he was asked to deliver something, and that's where the name came from. They were looking for the Courier Guy, and he was the Courier Guy. And so from there, firstly, obviously, a man of excellence, a man of his word, taking pride in his service, and also identifying a gap. So I think if you look at one of the things I speak about in chapter 3, when I talk about strategy, one of the points I make is that for you to build a valuable business, you have to understand the market and identify a market that is valuable. So he identified this valuable market, and then he took the bull by the horns, delivered the product, delivered the package, but then later on obviously decided that he needed to have expansion. I think he introduced other parties in his business through, I think, a franchise model, then had different locations and technology in terms of, the delivery and also the customer interface. So introduction of, leverage in his business as well. And I think the steward is also around leadership, bringing other leaders around you, bringing systems around you. And so when I talk about stewardship, I talk about, so the architect is the one that goes from me doing everything to me designing as the founder now, designing systems, getting, talent involved, and so on, creating, a framework to deliver, an execution framework to deliver. And that's what investors buy into. So the steward is one that is now essentially developing other leaders. So in other words, initially with the architect, you bring other leaders on board. You maybe have a way to induct them into the business, show them the ropes and so on, and eventually you build other leaders. And now you perhaps going from a more executive role to a non-executive role. In the last chapter of the book, I talk about the founder transition, where, in other words, you're stepping away from the business now, and maybe you are doing other things other than the business. Maybe you become an investor, maybe you're getting into philanthropy and so on. So that's ultimately where the steward ends up. He's no longer necessarily actively involved. It may be a non-executive role and something like that. And in Courier Guy case, we see that happening in the space of about 20 years, going from doer to someone that brings structure, brings other partners, bring technology, bring financial partners, and then eventually exits to a private equity investor. And now could be the role, could be a consultant to the private equity investors if something goes wrong in the business. Maybe there was a transition period where he still was involved. As the private equity investors now found got to know the business, and so on. And now that gives you opportunity to create another business where you can have, you can diversify somewhere else and the likes. So I hope I get the point across, but that's really what I mean by this doer, architect, steward transition. And like I say, in the book, in the final chapter of the book, where I talk about how to actually engage with investors and how to actually monetize your business, I have a chapter on that. Then I also deal with the human aspects of what happens after you've sold, and that then talks to the shift from being in the business to being, having other hats that you now wear as the steward.
And I think, Frensel, from my experience, both with this book as well as your previous